Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and in this chapter, we're going to look at the process of photosynthesis, how plants use the sunlight, energy from sunlight, to make their own food. And we're going to have a little review of some molecules and some cell parts that we learned about in past chapters and tie those together with this new idea about how organisms get their energy from food. And the next couple chapters is going to look at that. We learned some vocab words that kind of go along with that, and the idea of organisms that can make their own food using energy from sunlight. Green plants are a good example of organisms that can do that. There are a few bacteria that can also make their own food using energy from sunlight, and we called those organisms autotrophs. If you remember, that was a vocab word from back in our very first chapter, and we've seen it in a couple other chapters since then. Autotrophs, also called producers, because they can produce their own food. The other vocab word that kind of goes with that is heterotrophs. Remember, heterotrophs get their energy by consuming other organisms. We call them consumers. Animals are heterotrophs. You are a heterotroph. You get your energy from consuming other organisms. We can't make our own food. We have to eat food to get the energy. Fungi are heterotrophs. Most bacteria are heterotrophs. And we're going to look at that first process now in this chapter of how plants can use sunlight to make their own food molecules. So if you remember back in some of our past chapters, we talked about using energy in cells. And really, the reason plants are doing photosynthesis to make food is so that they have the energy they need to do the cellular processes that keep them alive. So if you remember back, we did a whole chapter on transport in our first semester. We talked about passive transport and active transport. Active transport needs energy to make things move in cells. And we talked about things like sodium-potassium pumps, endocytosis, exocytosis. Those are kinds of active transport that require energy. Other things that cells use energy for, we talked about movement. We did a whole unit on mitosis and meiosis, cell division, and moving chromosomes around inside cells during cell division requires energy. We talked about moving cell parts, cilia and flagella, helping things to move, helping cells to move, like the tail on a sperm cell, or cilia in your respiratory tract, moving particles that get trapped in the mucus there. We talked about using energy to make molecules. We talked about, we did a whole chapter on using messenger RNA to provide the information to build a protein, join amino acids to build protein molecules. We talked about reproduction, growth, development, all kinds of processes that cells use every day require energy, and that energy is going to come from the food molecules, either making our own food as a plant does, or consuming other organisms to get food molecules to provide energy for the things that organisms need to do to stay alive. Remember, we talked about this in our molecule chapter. We've seen it come back in a couple other chapters since then. It's a special kind of nucleotide subunit. Remember, nucleotides have a sugar component, in this case ribose, and a nitrogen base component, in this case adenine. And we remember our little subunit that we use to combine to make nucleic acids like DNA and RNA had one phosphate, but this has 3 phosphates, and this is an energy molecule used by all cells to store and transport energy. And the 3 P's should be a clue. This is ATP. We talked about ATP before, but we're going to revisit because this is a pretty important molecule, and that's part of this whole photosynthesis and respiration in our next chapter that's coming after photosynthesis. See how cells actually use the energy that's stored in food. So let's take a little closer look and remind ourselves about how this ATP molecule works. Remember, this is kind of like a rechargeable cell phone battery where we can charge up the molecule, store energy, and then release it in the cell where the cell needs energy to do all those processes like transport and movement and growth. So let's take a peek at this little molecule again. Remember, there's a ribose, a sugar, ribose sugar part. There's an adenine, that's one of the nitrogen bases you learned, and 3 phosphate groups. This molecule, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine triphosphate. And it works by switching forms back and forth between this form with 3 phosphate groups and this form that has only 2 phosphate groups. This is ADP instead of ATP, T for tri. This is diphosphate. Remember, di means 2. So this is adenosine diphosphate. Remember, we had di, like diploid meant a cell that had 2 copies of every organism. Di means 2. So this molecule has 2 phosphate groups. And remember, we talked about how we can add or remove phosphate groups to this molecule to store and release energy. So let's look a little bit about how this works. ATP is the molecule form that is the storage form, and if we add energy, we can add a phosphate group, and the energy is stored in that bond of the last phosphate. And when I want the energy to use in the cell, I can break that energy bond and release the power. So ATP releases the energy stored by removing that phosphate group and becoming ADP. 3 phosphates, I lose one, I become a 2-phosphate molecule, ADP. So ATP releases energy and the phosphate group, and I end up with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate and some energy. And that energy is used by the cells to do all the things that they need to do. Cells can add that phosphate group back. They can store energy by adding the phosphate back onto ADP and making it into ATP again. And the energy to do this comes from food molecules, like, for example, glucose. Remember, we talked about glucose was our food molecule that cells burn for energy. If your body is a car, glucose is the gasoline, and it's just like recharging your cell phone battery. If I take ADP with 2 phosphates and I add a phosphate group and that energy required to make the bond, I can store that energy as ATP. And those 2 forms are interchangeable, ATP to ADP, ADP back to ATP. The cell does that billions of times a second. We're always storing up energy and then using it for cellular activities. Okay, so we're going to watch a little video clip about how that actually works.
The molecule used by most organisms to
We're going to watch a little video clip about how that actually works.
The molecule used by most organisms to transfer energy is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. An ATP has 3 parts: adenine, ribose, and phosphate groups. Adenine is one of the bases found in DNA and RNA. Ribose is a sugar molecule found in RNA. The adenine and ribose portion of the ATP molecule is called adenosine. The 3 phosphates linked to the ribose in a chain are called triphosphate. Adenosine, together with the 3 phosphate groups, is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Notice the wavy lines between the 2 outer phosphates. The wavy lines represent high-energy bonds. Breaking the first high-energy bond in ATP releases energy and a free phosphate. This energy is used to power cellular activities. Adenosine, with only 2 attached phosphate groups, is called adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. Energy from the breakdown of food is used to change the ADP to an ATP. The energy stored in ATP is transferred and released when needed to power cellular activities. This process may occur as many as 10 million times per second in some cells.
Okay, so let's talk about how your body, how your cells are going to use this energy molecule. Remember, ATP is produced by transferring the energy from food molecules into that high energy phosphate bond at the end by adding that phosphate group on. And ATP is not good for storing a large amount of energy for a long time. It's good for quick energy. I need it right now. Release the phosphate group, release the energy, and use it. But if I want to store energy for long term, I might want to use another molecule for storage, and that's the glucose molecule. Remember, a glucose molecule stores energy. That's our food source, our fuel. 90 times more chemical energy stored in a glucose molecule than an ATP molecule. So ATP is kind of a temporary energy storage. We use it quick, we recharge it, we use it again, we recharge it, but it's not really good for storing energy long term. Cells only keep around enough ATP to last a few seconds, and then they keep recharging those ATP molecules over and over again by burning food, by burning glucose. So we can take that energy from the ATP molecules really coming from burning our food molecules, and that's how we store that energy for longer term as in carbohydrates. So let's think about carbohydrates. Remember back in chapter 1 we talked about carbs. Carbohydrates are molecules that have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Remember, C for carbon, H for hydrogen, O for oxygen. And they have it in a ratio 1 to 2 to 1. So if you count carbons and oxygens and hydrogens in this glucose molecule, you'll see that there are 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. And remember, we talked about writing chemical formulas, and putting the little number after that letter is telling you how many of that kind of atom are in our molecule. So glucose has the formula C6H12O6. And we're going to see that same pattern in lots of different carbohydrate molecules. We talked about some different ones. Glucose, for example, ribose. If you look at ribose, ribose is a 5-carbon sugar. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. If you look at these sugar molecules, and this is another sugar, glyceraldehyde, it's one of our smallest sugar molecules, only has 3 carbons in it, but notice always that same ratio, 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. C3H6O3, C5H10O5, C6H12O6. What if I had a 7-carbon sugar molecule? C7, what would the chemical formula be? Twice as many hydrogens. C7H14O7. We talked about monosaccharides, sugar molecules that are made. Remember, saccharide comes from the saccharose, sweet. Sugar molecules that are made up of just one sugar molecule are called monosaccharides. And glucose and ribose, those are sugars we talked about before. Those are examples of monosaccharides. We also learned in our very first chapter that carbohydrates are molecules that supply energy to cells, and cells are burning these glucose molecules for their energy needs. So if you remember back to our cell parts chapter, we talked about a cell part whose job it is to burn glucose and store the energy that's released as ATP, and that's our mitochondria. So this process of burning food and charging up our ATPs is happening in the mitochondria of our cells. Now, we're going to talk more about how that works in our next chapter. But glucose is going to be their energy molecule now that supplies the power to charge up our ATPs. And we're going to use carbohydrates not only to charge up ATP. Carbs can be building blocks for other molecules. If you think about some of those sugars that we learned about, ribose, deoxyribose, glucose, we use those to build other important molecules for the cell. Like, remember, ATP has a ribose sugar component. DNA and RNA have phosphates and sugars for their backbone. The twisted ladder, we talked about that. Polysaccharides, we talked about some different polysaccharides that are important, come from joining sugar molecules together. So let's dust off our brain a little bit and remember some polysaccharides we learned about from our first chapter. Remember, I can take glucose molecules and hook them together in a chain. Glucose, 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 glucose. And I can make some different kinds of polysaccharides now. And we make polysaccharides. Remember, poly means many, many sugars, by joining glucose molecules together in some different patterns. And we talked about three important polysaccharides back in our chapter 1, first semester: starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Let's refresh our brain a little bit about what those three polysaccharides do. So remember, glycogen is the way that animal cells, including you, store their sugar for later. It stores in our liver, it stores in our muscles. We're joining sugar molecules together to make glycogen. And that's the storage form that animals use to save their sugar for later. Plants store their sugar as starch. Think about plant foods that you know that are starchy, like cereals, rice, potatoes have starch in them. Starch is the way that plant cells store their sugar for later, store glucose. So they hook the glucose molecules all together and they make starch, and they stick it away in their roots and their leaves, and that's what they're making when they're doing photosynthesis, is saving the glucose that they make from sunlight and storing it as starch, as food for later on. Our third polysaccharide that we talked about was cellulose, and that's not really an energy molecule. Remember, cellulose is our make plant sturdy molecule, and it's used for building cell walls and making plants sturdy. So we're going to kind of focus on the two energy storage forms of glucose. That's the starch and the glycogen for our next two chapters here. That's the end of our slideshow, and thanks for watching.